This move, nf3, initiates a flexible opening, often leading to systems like the reti or English, aiming to control central squares and prepare for kingside castling without committing to a specific pawn structure early on. This move develops a piece towards the center, maintaining flexibility and preparing for common Indian defenses or transpositions into other systems. This move, 2, c4, aims to control the center and potentially transpose into a Catalan opening or English opening, challenging black's knight development and preparing to fight for central space. This move, 2, e6, signals a transition towards solid central control and prepares to develop the dark-squared bishop, common in many Indian defenses and queen's pawn structures. This move initiates a fianchetto setup for the king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling within a Catalan-like structure. This move challenges white's setup, aiming to open lines and control the center in the spirit of many Indian defenses. Developing the b2 pawn to b3 supports the fianchettoed bishop on g2 and prepares to challenge the center by either playing b-flat 2 to control the long diagonal or potentially pushing the c-pawn further. This move initiates a symmetrical pawn structure in the center, aiming to contest white's queenside space advantage and open up lines for black's pieces. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop, a key element in many queen's Indian or Catalan-like structures, aiming for control of the long diagonal and solidifying white's queenside pawn structure. This move develops a piece naturally, contesting the center and preparing to castle, fitting well within the queen's Indian defense framework. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental developing maneuver in this early stage of the game. Developing the bishop to e7 is a standard move, preparing to castle and supporting the central pawn structure, which is a common theme in many variations of the English opening. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure, preparing to develop the queenside pieces while maintaining flexibility for the d-pawn to advance later if advantageous. Developing the king to safety by castling is a fundamental positional principle, preparing the rook for future action on the d-file and consolidating the pawn structure. This move fianchettos the bishop to b2, developing it to an active diagonal where it exerts pressure along the h8a1 diagonal and supports potential central breaks. This move locks the central pawns, creating a strategically complex pawn chain where black aims to generate queenside counterplay, while white seeks to exploit weaknesses on the kingside or in black's cramped position. This move aggressively stakes a claim in the center, aiming to expand white's space and potentially restrict black's pieces, though it does commit the e-pawn and create potential weaknesses. By capturing the pawn on e3, black accepts an isolated d-pawn for white, potentially creating a weakness that can be targeted later in the game. This pawn exchange opens the f-file for white's rook, creating attacking possibilities and contesting control of the center after black's aggressive pawn push. This move develops the knight to an aggressive outpost, directly attacking white's queen and potentially disrupting white's control of the center and kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, supporting the pawn on e4 and preparing to challenge black's knight on g4, while also opening up the d-file for potential piece play. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the weakened light squares on white's kingside and preparing to contest the long diagonal if the center opens further. This move develops the knight to its most natural outpost, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing to contest control of the d5 square. This move repositions the queen to an active square, preparing to exert pressure on white's queenside and potentially target the weak c4 pawn. This move activates the rook to a central file, preparing to contest control of the c-file and support a potential advance of the d-pawn or pressure along the third rank. The rook anchors itself on the d-file, aiming to contest control of this central open line and prepare for potential pawn pushes or piece activity in the center. This move challenges the knight on g4, preventing it from potentially maneuvering to h6 or f2 and gaining valuable space for white's pieces. This knight maneuver aims to improve its central presence and potentially create threats on the kingside after white's pawn push, while also eyeing potential outpost squares. This move activates the knight to a strong central outpost, attacking black's queen and preparing to exchange off black's strong bishop on f6, improving white's central control and pawn structure. The aggressive queen sortie to a2 offers a material gain but risks overextension and allows white to activate pieces with tempo, potentially creating dangerous counterplay along the open c-file. This move, nxf6+, is a critical tactical exchange aimed at simplifying the position and disrupting black's pawn structure by forcing a recapture that will likely lead to an isolated pawn on g7. This capture opens the g-file for white's rook and creates a damaged kingside pawn structure for black, but also activates black's g7 bishop and queen. This exchange clarifies the pawn structure, aiming to simplify the position while creating weaknesses around black's king. This knight recapture activates your central knight, challenging white's control of the d4 square and preparing to potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure on the kingside after white's doubled f-pawns. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, controlling the long diagonal and preparing to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, preparing to castle queenside and contest the open c-file. This move, Ra1, initiates white's plan to contest the open a-file, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially create attacking chances against the vulnerable king. Capturing the pawn on b3 with the queen abandons the valuable a-file control and allows white to exploit the open file with their rook, potentially leading to tactical threats against black's kingside. This move actively challenges black's queen on a2, forcing it to retreat and simultaneously prepares to double rooks on the semi-open b-file to exploit potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure. Black's queen has maneuvered to the queenside and now, on qb4, it defends the pawn on b7 while simultaneously threatening to contest the open a-file, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. This move exchanges white's bishop for black's knight, simplifying the position and preventing black's knight from occupying the strong e5 square, while also opening the b-file for potential rook activity. This pawn capture, fxe5, opens the f-file for your rook and creates doubled, isolated e-pawns for black, which represent a significant long-term positional weakness. This move, while seemingly a straightforward piece exchange, is critical as it eliminates white's active bishop and gains a pawn, simplifying into a favorable endgame where white's remaining pawns are generally stronger. This pawn capture on b4 opens the c-file for white's rook and solidifies black's central pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses for future exploitation. This move capitalizes on black's weakened pawn structure and open kingside by capturing the advanced b-pawn, aiming to simplify into a favorable endgame where white's active pieces can exploit black's exposed king. This move prepares to recapture the bishop on b7. aiming to simplify the position and potentially create counterplay on the queenside due to white's exposed king. This move aggressively targets black's isolated queenside pawns, aiming to exploit the open A file and create immediate threats against the vulnerable material. This move initiates the critical race for the passed B pawn, forcing white to defend carefully against its timely advance towards promotion. White consolidates the pawn structure and prepares to contest the open B file, forcing black to defend the weak pawn. This move activates the bishop, preparing to contest the open A file and potentially disrupt white's rook's activity along the queenside. This move, qxe5, recaptures the pawn and opens the E file, putting pressure on black's weak pawn structure and potential weaknesses on the kingside. This move aims to develop the bishop to a more active square, challenging white's queen and potentially creating counterplay along the C file. This move forces the black king into the open and creates immediate threats of mate or significant material gain, exploiting black's vulnerable king position after the pawn structure collapse. The king is stepping out of the immediate danger zone of the open files and diagonals, seeking a more secure position and potentially preparing to re-enter the game through the central files. By capturing the knight on c6, white simplifies the position and eliminates black's active piece, aiming to exploit the resulting open files and potentially create a passed pawn. This pawn advance forces the white rook away from its attacking post, activating black's passed pawn and creating counterplay along the B file. This move forces the opponent's king into a precarious position, creating tactical opportunities and potentially leading to mate threats or significant material gain.